Shalom, friends. Welcome and thank you for being here with us. It is a delight to be with those in the room, those on the live stream, and those on the recording end. As we know, others are trickling in here early Monday morning on the West Coast, midday on the East Coast, and wishing everyone a Shavua Tov, a good, healthy week. There are no lack of problems for us to address locally, nationally, globally. And yet we can start joyfully just celebrating being together, and that we're all in this joyful struggle for justice together. So we hope that you'll enter the conversation with us today. I'm going to have the chance to talk with my teacher and mentor, Ruth Messenger, a little bit, and then open it up to folks in the Zoom as well as folks in the live stream, and to broaden the conversation, both to deepen our understanding of the realities and of what we can do. So first, I suspect everyone who's currently in this room knows, but for those who for some strange reason might not know, Ruth W. Messenger is the Global Ambassador for American Jewish World Service, an international human rights organization which she ran from 1998 to 2016. I was deeply, deeply impacted during those years. I'll say more about that. Additionally, Messenger does social justice and organizing work at the Jewish Theological Seminary and at the Meyerson JCC, and teaches Jewish women social justice entrepreneurs. For the New York Jewish Women's Foundation, she recently completed the development of a social justice and racial justice curriculum for Melton schools. Very exciting. Ruth is a trained social worker and previously had a 20-year career in elected office in New York City. She serves on several boards, has received several honorary degrees, is a member of SAJ Judaism, that stands for all, is married to an educator and has 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 3.5 great-grandchildren. One who I just learned lives with her, which is wonderful. I have to say also that I was, in no small way, sometimes you talk about interventions in your life, and they were one of a million. But my experience in AJWS, in college, post-college, in rabbinical school, post-rabbinical school, was completely transformational for me in ways that I don't know if I'd be a rabbi, I don't know if I'd be a social justice activist, in very deep ways, and Ruth's role in that was incredible. So Ruth, thank you so much, as always, for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, despite your over-exaggeration and hyperbole, thank you very much.
Great. So friends, until we get to the open conversation, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat next to us here. And, it's always hard to say this is the most pressing issue of our time, because we have climate change, because we have war, because we have global poverty, because we have people dying at any moment where we can make an intervention. And yet, if we created a hierarchy of domestic priorities, it would be difficult to not place the risks facing democracy top on that list, because democracy is what fundamentally sustains this country and has the potential to sustain it to its grandeur. Professor Emeritus Michael Walzer at Princeton University has identified that, of course, it would be anachronistic to say the Torah is democratic. He shows how the deep roots for democracy are planted. The seeds for democracy are planted in the Torah, and he lays out a number of very interesting ways on how that's done. And so this is a Jewish contribution, and at the heart of it is not just the societal governmental structures, but the fundamental notion that we talk about so much, that all human beings are created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. And that means every human being counts and matters, and that means has a voice. And so we have a great stake in this as Jews theologically, and we have a great stake in this as Jews who understand what it's like to not live in a democracy and what that means for all minority groups. So Ruth, let's start on the abstract. Before we even get domestic, I'm going to ask you a hard global question. Should we be advocates for democracy on the global arena? And that might feel like an obvious yes, but how do we think about this balance between cultural imperialism and moral relativism as we as Americans, as Westerners, advocate for democracy in the global South and around the world?
Okay, so I'm going to take a either further step back since your introduction was so glowing. I just want to say that Shmuly is one of the many people who taught me early on in my learning, coming out from politics, going to American Jewish World Service, learning more Jewish teaching that underscored what I believed and what I did. But he's among the very few people who not only taught, but practices every day that study is only important because it leads to action. Shmuly is an activist who bases all of his action on deep thought and analysis, but we have stayed partnered on many different issues because he believes in acting on what he believes. So that's where I would start. And then I want to answer your question about America's role in the world in a complicated way. Cultural imperialism, that is thinking that we should get to control other people and we should get to tell them how to run their lives, we know is a bad thing. It's bad domestically, it's bad in our own families, it's bad in our own communities. And we have too many examples of it in the history of the United States, particularly the race-based history of the United States. That said, I think we do have an American and a human and a Torah-based motivation to fight oppression, to fight authoritarianism, to fight division, to fight intolerance. And so that puts us on the road to saying that certain places are, sometimes in this country, by the way, but that certain forms of government, certain kinds of leaders are bad for the entire populace. What it gets replaced with as you move that, we don't have the perfect model. And in fact, it's just interesting. We shouldn't go off on this next point because it's too long a discussion, but I actually find more people who are paying attention to the news these days and are distressed by the obvious splits in our Congress saying maybe there is something to the parliamentary form of government. So I don't know the answers to that, but I just think it's interesting that Americans who were so sure that everything we did was right and that we had the right model, partly because that's what we were taught, which is too bad, are now themselves saying, wait a minute, we can see the flaws in some aspects of our systems of government, and we should be looking a little more deeply. So no, we shouldn't tell other people what to do, but we have an obligation to help them stop things that are clearly hurtful to them. That's what I would say. And then I want to underscore what you said about democracy and voting rights. And I think I've come to this slightly slowly because, as you know, I could and have discoursed forever on global poverty issues and global human rights issues. I can talk about environment and climate change. I can praise your incredible work at the border and talk about the need to not only provide services to people in need who are coming into this country, but to try to shape a rational immigration policy for this country. But it's as soon as you get to that next level, a rational immigration policy, a sensible commitment on environmental goals, that you realize that none of that will work unless we protect and preserve our democracy. And the key point for this discussion and for my discussions these days is I don't feel good about it, but I feel it necessary now to say that our democracy is seriously under threat.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I assume that point you made in passing that you thought we shouldn't go into, which if this is what you're referring to, I agree, we shouldn't go into it, was the collapse of the Israeli coalition. Is it right?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So if folks didn't hear that today, yeah, there'll be another call for election, presumably, in the very near future.
The question is, what are the strengths of that model as opposed to the strengths of our model? And who knows? And we ought to be paying more attention to that. I also want to say one other thing, because I agree with you. First of all, it is absolutely hilarious that you cited Michael Walzer, because Michael Walzer knows this, but Michael Walzer was the first section instructor, so he was not yet a professor, that I had who told me I was not living up to my potential.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
It's absolutely true. He handed me back a blue book in my freshman or sophomore year with a note that said, you can do better than this. I will never forget it.
Oh my goodness. And the truth is, we don't only need that in college, we need that our whole lives. People telling us, gently and lovingly that we're not living up to our potential, that we can do better. Some people are so defensive about that, that it's an attack on them, but the truth is it's a sign of love if it's coming from love. And boy, if he gets any credit for a minor intervention in what you've achieved, then I owe him an extra source of gratitude.
You do. I also want to say that you quoting Michael, you gave a really eloquent, planted the seeds for all of us to keep thinking about the extent to which Judaism believes in, practices, and preaches democracy. I agree with that. And I want to say that the other half of that is that we actually know from the last several centuries that Judaism thrives in a democracy and not in authoritarian states. And so we want to invest in the maximum degree of quality democracy because it's true to our basic teaching about people being equal to each other. But we also want to live in democracies because they are better for, as we say, they are better for the Jews than other systems of government.
Thank you. So not to belabor this too long, but touching upon different models of democracy, because it's easy to say democracy is a positive thing, but as you said, there's many different models, and one of the consistent concerns is that in operating by majority rule, that minority voices get drowned out and not attended to. So how do you think about models of democracy that both honor that the majority is what should be celebrated, the majority of popular vote, the majority of citizens, but also that there's still a minority who are a part of that society of citizens, but also a minority of non-citizens, and their will has to be accounted for as well. So democracy is not enough on its just basic legal level.
So I would agree. I mean, I guess I'm focused right now and also thinking up to this program on really what I just see to the extent that our voting systems, let me say that for a minute, to the extent that our voting systems have evolved dramatically since initially in this country when we won our independence, only white males who owned property could vote. We have come a long way since then. And what I'm most concerned about now is the many, many ways in which we're sliding back, making it harder for some of those, because that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is, yes, you need systems, I want to underscore what you said, that pay attention to people who only have a minority degree of power, that you don't silence them. But if you have real free speech, Shmuly, and real freedom of association, all of which are under some question right now, then those minority groups, and we've seen this, have the capacity to come together, have a capacity to assert themselves, and within our democratic system have the capacity to, go back to a point you made earlier, to form coalitions, to move forward, let's say an idea like Black Lives Matter, and to build their power. So without being able to answer your question about exactly which form of democracy, I want to say there are many opportunities in democracies, plural, for groups to be able, for minority groups to be able to make themselves heard.
Great. So let's zoom into the current moment and some of the threats. As we all know, legislators in states that have a long track record of voter suppression often implement laws and engage in activities that make it harder for certain segments of the population to vote. And let me share just a few of some of those most common ways that voting rights are undermined across the country, and we could try to unpack some of these. Voter ID requirements, lack of language access, voter roll purges, polling place closures and consolidations, lack of funding for elections, provisional ballot requirements, reduced early voting, reduced voting hours, poorly trained poll workers, partisan election administrators, creation of at-large local offices to dilute minority vote. This just scratches the surface, but these are some of the most common forms of attacks. Now, since the 2022 election, we've seen, I think it's 17 states, but I haven't checked in the last few days, that have positively enacted new protections of the election process. But there's roughly
not protections, new attacks on the election process.
No, there's been some states that have actually new protections, and then roughly an equal number of states that have put new attacks on.
Right.
So I would love to kind of get your sense of what you think is happening right now and where you think some of those greatest threats are emerging from.
Okay. I want to add one thing to your list. I'll come back to your focus on voting because it's the issue I raised and it's so important. But we want to recognize as well the redrawing of districts, what's called gerrymandering. Because again, it's about half the states right now that have Republicans in control of the executive branch and both legislative houses. And in those states, we are seeing the evidence, and we have every reason to believe that first districts lines will be redrawn in ways that are unfair, just what you said before, that create minorities where they don't need to exist. And then we have in those states all of those attacks on voting. And you gave a very long list, and it's appropriate that you gave that long list because every single one of those is something that those states that want to suppress people's right to vote are trying. They're doing all of those different things. My least favorite example, just because it's so dramatic, is in the state of Texas. If you, let's say you're going to college in the state of Texas, and you want to be able to vote in the state of Texas for the 4 years that you're there, you cannot get a right to vote if you bring an envelope from a college residence hall that says that you live there or that you pay bills there. You cannot use that to establish your right to vote. But in the state of Texas, if you have a gun carry permit, you can use that to establish your right to vote, which lets you know a lot about people's values. But I think really you listed every one of those issues. Obviously, we could go more broadly because you made a reference much earlier to non-citizens. And of course, in New York City, we are proud to say that we've actually passed a law now that says that green card residents in New York City can vote in city elections. We haven't had such an election yet, but we think that's potentially 800,000 people. So it's big numbers. But everything you said, places are shutting down polling places. They're changing the laws. Some of that I see in my own state. For some reason, New York just changed the law. It's too arcane to go into for this program, but it just will make things a little bit more confusing for informed voters. And why do they do that? Because somehow there's some desire not to be clear, not to be helpful. I always like to point out, not where you are, even further west than where you are, in the state of Oregon, which is last I looked was part of the continental United States, virtually nobody goes to a polling place. Everyone votes by mail. They instituted it. They sent out vote by mail ballots. They say, here's how you vote by mail. Here's how you vote online. And everyone does it. And you just think like, okay, I live in the same country. But because, which is sort of underlying a lot of what we're talking about, because we said in developing the laws here that many of these issues could be decided by the states, we're now seeing that the states are not deciding them as if they were part of a greater whole, as if they were interested in maximizing the vote, but are deciding them in their own states for their own reasons, very specifically to suppress minority voting.
Now, on the one hand, so it seems like over here, we talk about voter suppression, and over there, they talk about their concerns of voter fraud as their justification for, these new restrictions. Is there any space where we agree? Like, is there any space where voter fraud is a concern, where it wouldn't merely be voter suppression, where there could be some collaborative work? I mean, I think most of their claims are bogus, but we did see in 2016 the Russian intervention process. And so, how do we take the voter fraud concern seriously while still defending against voter suppression?
Oh, Shmuly, you're such a good rabbi. I'm sorry, I can't buy into that. I think I think that maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Look, yesterday, 20 members of the Congress actually managed to identify some elements of a gun safety bill that they thought they could all agree on that we might get passed. So I'll buy. That's fantastic. But I think that that on voting the former president of the United States, God save us, did an unbelievable job using social media and his own approaches to convince people that the system was rife with fraud. I would point out that there is an earlier example of that before social media. Ronald Reagan, who was, let me be clear, a much better president than Donald Trump, although he was not of my persuasion. But Ronald Reagan talked endlessly about welfare queens. And he led people in the United States, I mean, people that were my best friends, to actually believe that there was some set of people who were getting cash benefits and food stamps and coming into grocery stores and using them to buy orange juice to go with the vodka and using them to buy steak. I mean, it just went on and on. And you had large numbers of what I would like to say were otherwise intelligent people believing that the welfare system was being ripped off. And now you have Trump on an infinitely larger scale and with something much more fundamental to our democracy, saying that it's all fraud. And so you see in the polls that very dramatic, huge percentages of the people who have decided to support Trump and to support his return, believing it. But you have other people nervous about, is there voter fraud, where there's like virtually no evidence of it. Yes, you pointed to 2016. Yes, I'm not saying that nothing can happen, but we have states with, as you said, poorly trained poll workers, unclear hours. The website in New York that I keep referring people to, I love the name of it. The name of the website is whosontheballot.org, and it tells you every single thing you need to know about what's legal, whatever. But by and large, we are conducting elections, although we could be doing so much better. We are conducting elections without evidence of fraud. And so having endless legislative proposals in the states that you and I both mentioned that are premised on needing to change the law, tighten the system to eradicate fraud is just, they're building on a foundation that doesn't exist.
Great. So 2 or 3 more questions for me, and then we'll open it up. Before we get to the filibuster, since you brought up gerrymandering, maybe you can help us understand what's happening. This is a very complicated system that many of us understand only on the broad level of how redistricting is, preventing democracy by making it, silencing minority votes by cutting them out. But who is in charge of this? What's happening right now? Where is it happening mostly? Like, what can we do around the gerrymandering issue?
Okay, so the first step here, just procedurally, the first step here is the census. So I think a lot of people probably on this call remember that for various reasons, there was really good grassroots effort around the 2020 census. Everybody wanted to be sure they got counted. There's some competition, which you're probably aware of, between and among New York, Texas, and California about who's going to have the largest number of growth of people so that they can get the most congressional seats. So the census determines how many people live in each state. And that's then used to determine how many congressional districts will exist in that state, because the one thing we're not doing is changing the number of representatives. Right now, we have 435 members of the Congress and 100 members of the Senate. But it's Congress that depends on the districting. Then, if you're going to make 435 districts in 50 different states, you have several guidelines. But the one thing is clear is that when you do the census, you then have to look at your lines and see if they need to be changed. They might need to be changed because your urban district has swelled as more and more people moved in. There might be exactly the opposite reason. There's been flight from some part of the state. In Arizona, where you are, more and more people are seeing it as a place to move. They have a second home and now they better, so the numbers are growing. So there is a legitimate need, and it's left to the states. That's the point that we've been making here, both overtly and quietly, implicitly. The states then have some system, and there is no mandate for exactly what the system should look like. And to the extent that there's a mandate for how to draw the district, it leaves lots and lots of opportunities. It says a congressional district should be X. Let's say 250,000 people. It's larger than that, but 250,000 people. Okay, but how do you get your 250,000 people? And the example that I always give to people, and I'm going to do it with my hands, if you imagine a big circle, what we tend to call in the United States a metropolitan area. And in the center of that metropolitan area is a small circle, which is the actual urban area. So anybody on this call can understand that there are two things I could do. I could say, okay, there are 1 million people here. That means there are 4 of my hypothetical districts. One way to do it is to make the center circle 1 district, because it's more densely packed, and then take the ring around it and divide it in thirds. And the other way to do it is like a pie. Now, the impact of those two changes is the world. Totally different. If you assume that people, which we know to be true, that people in that center city live more densely, are more likely to be poor, are more likely to be people of color, then the question of whether you give them their own district, which means they definitely get more or less the highest chance of, quote, electing one of their own to represent them, or do you say, sorry, you are in 4 different districts where you're going to have to fight to have your voice heard. So the districting can go a lot of different ways. And what we've seen, I think it's about 5 states across the country, that's a guess, where the districting, the lines that were drawn have been so upsetting to one party or another that people have taken them to court, and the judges have ruled that these are lines, these look to the judges like lines that were drawn to favor one group over another instead of to be as relatively equitable as possible. All I'm trying to point out with my little circle example is you could make equitable districts of equitable size and still have very different results. And so who gets to draw it? Does the state legislature, which is going to be either Republican or Democrat, get to oversee it? And in New York, just small because it's a national program, but we've just suffered every possible worst example you could imagine. We've had lines drawn, we have lines taken to court, we have lines challenged. We have different lines challenged at different times. So we are in New York now facing 2 different primaries instead of 1, because some lines are ready and some lines aren't ready. And the district lines that were drawn, well, I'll just give you the one example. It happens to be where I live, but for the first time in the history of the United States, 2 sitting committee chairs in Congress are being asked to run against each other.
Wow.
So,
well, that circle was the best way I've ever heard it explained. I think that I'm going to use that in the future. And so that was a very helpful way to understand what's happening that you mapped out. So friends, while I have many other questions I'd love to ask, I've taken up about half of our time already with my questions. So I would love to open it up to y'all and hear some of the things that you're thinking. Hi, Suzanne, please.
So thank you both for that very clear explanation of what's going on. What I really want to know is what can we do, I mean, really concretely, because it's very scary.
okay, so the one thing I want to say, because as you both know, since I've studied with both of you, I desperately believe that we should not reinvent the wheel. So I just want to say that this is an area in which there are some spectacular not-for-profit organizations already at work. I'll name Free for bringing cases and challenging voter suppression efforts. I would call out the American Civil Liberties Union and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And for actually answering Suzanne's question of what should be done, I would like to highlight the work of the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. And the League of Women Voters, for those of you who are as old as I am, used to be sort of like some nice little old ladies who would help little old ladies know how to vote. But they've like waded in with a passion and looked state by state, and in your state, wherever you live, there's a League of Women Voters that will tell you what are some of the best changes to make. The other aspect of your question that is really good, Suzanne, is that this is an area, I think even more than the gun control area, where any 1 or 2 of these steps makes a good difference. Like if you can mandate early voting and maximize, the opposite of what Shmuly mentioned, maximize the number of places where you can early vote, where you can take your ballot and drop it off. That's a change. If And I think this is what they do in Oregon, and Suzanne, I think it's what they do in California.
Yes, I was going to say, we also have vote by mail, and we get our
Yeah,
ballots way ahead
in
of time.
California, they send everybody an absentee ballot, and you can decide a mail ballot, and you can decide whether or not to use it. When I raised that in New York 2 years ago, people thought that I had the facts wrong. You know, so it's like, so in New York, just for an example, if you want to vote absentee, my husband just went through this for his mother. If you want to vote absentee, you have to fill out a form requesting an absentee ballot. So, you know, that's like 3 steps to get the ballot, to take it to somebody who's homebound. So there, I would say that literally any change, and in every state where anybody on this webinar is, there are people in your state legislature. Zellner Myrie is the state senator in New York who's carrying a lot of this. He's wonderful, but they have an agenda of changes, and those changes, Shmuly, literally identify every single thing that you listed as things that people are doing to suppress the vote. There is an affirmative legislative action that would diminish or eliminate that possibility.
Great, Eddie. Yeah, jump in, Eddie.
No, thank you so much to both of you. And thank you, Ruth, for being very vocally clear on this issue. Something that myself and my great mentor, Rabbi Shmuly, did during the 2020 elections was we were both keepers of the peace and poll watchers. And here specifically where myself and Rabbi Shmuly live in Arizona, we noticed a high rise and a very scary, scary rise of voter intimidation, where we saw a lot of a particular party at hand who was being very vocal in targeting people, and specifically minorities. I remember seeing signs that, like, outside of polling places that said either vote this party or you must die because you're a traitor. And that this was happening in Arizona. And based off of the current trends, and we're seeing that that's going to happen a lot more, I'm really worried about this election cycle. I'm wondering what your recommendation can be for the Jewish community to oppose and maybe come together to combat the voter intimidation that's happening across the United States.
All right, so that's a terrifying addition to the story. Yes, again, the procedures of the Board of Elections, the question of, like, the signs that say you can't get between a sign and the polls, the question of watching who's outside and what they're saying, and looking to control that or counter it. I want to give a shout out here, and Eddie, I will send you for you and Shmuly to post, because it's just a new effort and I don't have enough of the details, but a man that many people on this call probably know, Aaron Dorfman, who used to work at American Jewish World Service, recently left his job at the head of the Lippman Camphor Family Foundation and has started an initiative called something like Judaism and Democracy. And what I most like about it, Eddie, and the reason it's responsive to you, is it's like really tachlis, nitty-gritty details. And he's talking about people stepping forward to be trained as poll watchers where the poll watchers are untrained, stepping forward to be lawyers. And that's another thing that doesn't necessarily relate to everyone on this call, but in state after state, we're going to need lawyers who are watching what goes on. We're going to need poll watchers. We're going to need people ready to bring cases. In New York, we've had, I'm sure elsewhere in the country, you've seen this, there are people lawyers standing by who've gone to court to keep polls open because at 8 o'clock at night, there was a line of 500 people, usually because they were being processed badly. And they've gone to court literally at that moment and gotten through and into a judge to sign to keep the polls open. So there are some very direct and specific tasks. And I think that would extend to developing a cadre of people who would be on the lookout for intimidation, who would know under what law they could be reported. I would look for at either ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center. I would ask them that question specifically. If it happened last time, it's going to happen this time. They are the people who want to suppress the vote are coming in like gangbusters. By the way, one thing we didn't mention, Shmuly, I just want to keep, there's so many things, but there are increasingly good efforts around the country to identify. It's usually the Secretary of State, sometimes it's the State Attorney General, and sometimes it's the governor or a named governor appointee, not an election, but those people are in charge of a lot of the issues that we talked about. So also looking at elections to get secretaries of state who are committed to expanding the vote instead of restricting it makes a difference. I want to make a point here because I know that people whose faces I can see on the screen know this, but 95% of what we need to do to protect the vote in the ways we're talking about is nonpartisan. The citizens of this country, the non-citizens of this country, the elected officials of this country, the lay activists of this country can engage in nonpartisan activity. But for the point of view, purpose of this webinar, rabbis can engage in nonpartisan activity. I'm now making the rounds of some West Side synagogues where I live just to tell people that there are 2 primaries and why, and that there is early voting and absentee ballot voting. That's all nonpartisan activity. As long as I don't stand at somebody's bima and announce who they should be voting for, it's all legitimate. So I think it's important to get that idea across. But Eddie, I think you have a great story. I would go directly to, I would look at the Arizona state law, and then I would go to one of those legal groups and tell them that you know what happened last time and what should you do about it this time.
Great. So our friend Austin here is immersed in the streets working with the unsheltered on a daily basis, and even doing it in the 110, 115 degree temperatures. And maybe Austin would want to share a little bit about his experience with registration issues for folks who have no home, and for others who are vulnerable, like homeless or native voters who live in the reservation. So Austin, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, my friends. Hope you're all doing well this morning. So I lead Arizona Jews for Justice's homeless outreach program called AZ Hugs for the Houseless. And we do a lot of work surrounding the issue of voter registration for those experiencing homelessness in particular. And it's a really strong, issue in my heart, because I've seen a lot of folks who are very passionate about, the betterment of our country. And a lot of folks who are very, very interested in voting, but there are often a lot of barriers. It's very difficult to hold on to an ID, for example, on the streets. And if you lose your ID, it sets you back a step in a multitude of ways, but especially with voting as well. That takes time, that takes effort, that can take money or transportation. But, one thing that we did in the last election cycle is we would go camp to camp, find folks, we'd mobilize our teams. And it was really beautiful to see so many people, come together, for this same civic goal. I think it's a very complicated issue, though, as well, because there are a lot of folks who may be difficult to find, or a lot of folks who may be, unable to make it to the polling station, or who don't have a mailing address. And I guess, my question for the group is, what is the correct way to, engage with this community in terms with voting? How do we get, the most amount of people involved? Is it education? Is it working with, various shelter systems? I think it's a complicated issue that, probably takes a complicated response, but I guess that would be my question to the group.
So I guess Shmuly himself might have some things to say about this, but for me, there's like 2 pieces of this. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. That would be the first thing to say. But the first one is seeing what the laws are. And again, the laws are right now, I think, state by state. So if in fact you live on a reservation, if in fact you are currently without an address, what can you do to register? What address can you use? It's important to know that, because there's no point, as you say, these are people whose lives are full of problems. There's no point in helping them understand the importance of voting if in fact there isn't going to be a way for them to vote. So the first thing is to know exactly what the state allows. I know that in the last presidential election, there were some innovations, which I don't remember. Austin, you probably know them better than I, for indigenous peoples on reservations to be able to use something as an address, whatever it was. But it's important to know that. Then I think you have what you alluded to, but it's actually an issue that, while it's dramatic in the populations you're talking about, we would all tell you that it affects a lot of other people. And that is people who don't believe that voting makes a difference. So then that becomes like a whole educational piece. Is like this, here are stories about what has happened when people went to vote. Here are ways in which laws get changed, in which different people get elected. Again, that's not a partisan statement, as long as you're not, touting one person, because enough people got elected. And then the third answer to your question about what to do, and it's an important one, I just sent somebody a note on this, is to support groups like Arizona Jews for Justice, to support groups, I'm serious, that are doing civic education. I work with a group in New York that raises money for congressional candidates all over the country. That is partisan activity. But in states where we know that there are some of the list of problems that Rabbi Shmuly listed earlier, we are also identifying not-for-profit civic organizations and raising money for them, which is tax-exempt money for our donors. And these are groups that will do civic education, that will do voter registration in advance, that will do get out the vote. So that's a very important piece of the answer to getting, and it goes back to Shmuly's original question about what about the more marginalized groups, what about minorities, and who's working to make a difference. So now I get to tell a quick story, because stories work. When I was last in politics in 1997, my adult daughter, who was in Boston, came down to help me campaign and said that she was bringing a young Latina woman that she'd met in Boston who was interested in seeing what a campaign was like. So she came down with her friend Julia. Julia was like the world's most hyper engaged volunteer. She was fantastic. She worked for me for several weeks. She went back to Boston in the ensuing, whatever it is, 10 years, 15 years. She established a family. She founded a not-for-profit organization in the Latina community. And then she decided to run for office. And a year ago, she ran for city council at large in Boston, doing a lot of the work that you're talking about, Austin, urging people in her various communities to register and to vote. The results of the election were so close that a runoff was decreed by the state of Massachusetts. And we sat through the weeks of the runoff, and Julia won by one vote. And so you can look her up online. Her name is Julia Mejia, and she's making waves in Boston, and she won by one vote. And that's something to keep telling people. That's why it still happens.
Awesome. Thank you. So I want to bring in our friend Susan Lubeck, who is at Jews United for Justice. Susan, we'd love to thank you for the great work you do. We'd love to bring you in the conversation also.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate this. Well, in organizing, we just talk, the kind of classic question is what keeps you up at night? And I just want to say, this keeps me up at night regularly. So thanks so much for the wisdom and the opportunity to hear your thoughts on this. Another piece that I want to throw in is to see if you all have additional thoughts, is just that, unfortunately, Ruth, you were saying that, yeah, like just information about voting, that's not partisan. Unfortunately, voting rights in some corners has become a partisan issue. It is being defined that way by the right wing very intentionally. And just the idea that there should be voting rights is like, that's a Democratic Party conspiracy. And it's just, it's like this idea that the Overton window of what's considered normal politics, normal political discourse has moved to the right significantly. And we know that there's massive, massive disinformation about, this idea that the 2020 elections were stolen, that voting rights is about voting fraud. And we're just, we're being subjected to a reality where we're just in a massive, sea of disinformation. Many just regular people are, and where political violence even is being normalized, sort of similar to what Eddie was talking about, that and of course January 6th as like an extreme manifestation of that. So sometimes I feel that here we are plugging away, trying to play by the rules and move things along, but we're kind of fighting. I don't know what the right metaphor is. We need maybe a different set of tools, and I know one of the things that I've seen in all the years since Trump came in is any space you go to that has volunteers, whether it's ACLU, Indivisible, on and on, League of Women Voters, it's full of American Jews, because American Jews understand what's at stake when our democracy is at risk. I think what Aaron's doing is great, but I just wonder, is there more that we could be doing to help people connect the dots and feel a sense of agency and deal with the level and type of really serious threats that we're facing, in addition to, supporting the ACLU, legal women voters, reaching out to people who are unhoused, all that's so important, but just the level of extremity we're dealing with. I just love to hear your take on that.
So it's, I guess, the sad part of my answer is I'm not sure we've invented anything new than the systems we have to go out and to organize. But what you described so eloquently, I would have said is simply, and I'm going to say this in a good way, is that the people who are talking about fraud, talking about voter suppression as necessary, spreading what we all believe, and it's been pretty well demonstrated, is not true. Those people are shameless. We could use a little more shamelessness on the other side. We are tentative. That's why I went out of my way to say what I know that you at Jews United for Justice understand. Too many places that I go, and Shmuly and Suzanne will tell you, because I discussed this with Global Justice Fellows, too many rabbis that I talk to they have two different answers, neither one of which makes me happy. One is it's partisan. I can't do that from the Bima. And I'm like, no, could we look at the rules? Could we unpack it? And the second one, which is sort of what you're referring to, is, oh, well, it's impolitic to do it. Some people might not like it. And I'm sorry to say this, but that comes back to my most favorite issue, which is moral courage, which is like leaders have to step forward. And in my judgment right now in New York, where, as I said, it's not so much that voter suppression is rampant, it's that voter confusion is very big right now. To be honest on this webinar, I don't understand why I have to be calling rabbis to say, here is what you need to say this Shabbos, because the window for absentee ballots closes on Monday. That's what we're doing. And some candidates, by the way, are doing it. That is, some candidates are taking the nonpartisan step, like they're not saying, vote for me, Susan, for city council. They're simply putting out a piece of information that says, here's when you vote and where you vote. But I would like us to see us more rooted in the notion that as we've tried to establish in the last hour, that democracy is essential, that it's Jewish, that it's essential for Jews, and that we need to be as tough as the other guys, because they're not doing anything brand new. They're spreading their story. I'll try to be nice from it and just say it's their story, it's their version of the truth. And we need to be more aggressive in doing ours. We need to say it makes a difference. We need to say, if you care about gun safety and I want to do I was with my congressman the other night at the Tikkun at Shavuot. My congressman is Jerry Nadler. And he got asked a lot of substantive questions about, Congressman, where do you stand on this? What are you doing on that, without going to the issues? And he said to them, folks, I need 2 more Democrats in the Congress. So I'm not, that's the most partisan thing I'm going to say on this program. But the point is, he was just straightforward. He was like, I could tell you where I stand on that issue. I could tell you about my bill on the other issue. I could tell you about the legislation I've drafted 10 years ago. I'm telling you that we don't have the votes right now. And so whether it's fighting voter suppression on a not-for-profit way, engaging as Jews, I know Jews United for Justice does, engaging in communities where there's not enough participation and urging people to get involved, or it's the nonpartisan get out the vote, or it's the subsequent partisan get out the vote. We need to be doing this work. And again, I'm going to say 90% of it can be done through our not-for-profit organizations, which include our synagogues.
Thank you so much. Great question, Susan, and thank you, Ruth. Our last question today from my great colleague, Eddie Chavez Calderon, and then Ruth, after responding, if you want to offer any closing comments. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be able to participate in this. I think that what we saw, especially in the 2020 elections, was that a lot of folks are very, very focused on federal elections, but tend not to be as educated on down ballot voting and in-state voting. I think that Jews predominantly are very, very democratically centered and being able to be participating in the democratic system. We often get asked what we do next. How would you recommend that we can get our Jewish community engaged in teaching down ballot voting? Whereas where I see that we have a huge flaw. Here in Arizona, everybody said that we had a huge win federally, but if you look at locally, we unfortunately lost every single race down ballot. And we're seeing the attacks and we're seeing the repercussions of that in horrible policies attacking the LGBT community, our voting rights, the immigrant community. I mean, it's just going on and on and on. So I'd love to hear your insights on that. Thank you.
I guess it's frankly more of the same, although I think it offers like sort of a new kind of step-in opportunity in most likely in the quote unquote off years. That is like when there's not a presidential election, is saying to people, we need you now more than ever, because if you don't come out for fill in the blank, the Secretary of State election or the redistricting formation, or what you're talking about, Eddie, which is just like the participation on the local town council or city council, then we're going to keep being hurt by people whose agenda is against us, against minorities, against the people who are not fighting discrimination, sometimes are fostering discrimination. These issues are happening right here at home. Now, here's a big item, but you guys in Arizona are so well organized, you could think about it. And that is, we could all be doing in our spare time, that's a joke, going back and seeing what happened to our schools teaching civics. And the shortest handle to that would be making an effort before 2022 or maybe 2024 in whatever jurisdiction you are in, to see that every high school graduate is given a voting, a voter application. You can vote when you just about the age that you graduate from high school. We don't teach it. I'm not sure you're going to change the curriculum or the teaching of civics in the next 2 years, but you can in fact make it easier for 18-year-olds to, they become members of the Jewish faith on their bar bat mitzvah. They become members of American democracy when they turn 18, and we should recognize it and make it easy for them to do that.
Amazing. This has been such an inspiring and informative program, Ruth. I don't know if you have any final charge to us before we wrap up here.
Well, I would reiterate what I said before near the beginning, which is this is, I think, a really serious issue, and we are all challenged by a large number of really serious issues, and it becomes a little too easy to wring our hands. And instead, we need to be looking at the issues, doing some analysis, finding the groups that are already doing the work, not recreating the wheel, and then taking action. Shmuly and I both talked about the roots of democracy in the Jewish faith and the protections that are offered to Jews in democratic polities. I would, slightly use the quote, the prophetic observation written for a slightly different situation, but to say that the prophet Jeremiah says, work for the good of the cities where I have made you go, because if they are prosperous, you will be prosperous too. And that's wise advice. If you are not participating in the most basic stepping stones that we are trying to protect and preserve and strengthen in American democracy, then you can't complain when decisions go against you. And Eddie, I think that applies to local races as well. It's like this city council or this state legislature did this and that, and it wouldn't have if we participated in elections. Since Americans, going right back to Shmuly's beginning, since Americans like to think about how great we are all the time, I would just point out that in the 2020 presidential election, where American voter turnout was relatively high because there was a question of like who was going to get elected, our participation was 56%. And in Western Europe, voter participation in elections, national elections, is over 80% in most countries in Western Europe. And just in case you want something to think about, in both Australia and Argentina, voting is compulsory.
Wonderful, Ruth. As always, just a delight and so challenged and supported to learn with you. Wishing everyone a beautiful day, and let's continue this holy sacred work together.
Thank you,
Have a
Shmuly.
terrific
Thank
day.
you for all
so
your
much.
work.
Many blessings for good health.